There is one rule that every civilization in human history has followed without exception. You do not build where the water is not. You put your cities next to rivers. You farm where rain falls. You survive where nature allows it. If nature stops cooperating, you leave. That was the deal. For thousands of years, not one empire, not one dynasty, not one superpower ever managed to break it. The Romans tried to hold arid territory in North Africa. They failed. The Mesopotamians built some of the most advanced irrigation systems the ancient world had ever seen, and still collapsed when the water ran out. Every single attempt to outrun geography ended the same way. The desert always wins. So, when you hear what is happening right now in northwestern China, your first instinct is going to be disbelief. Because what engineers have pulled off there does not just bend that ancient rule, it snaps it in half. Picture this: a pipeline longer than the entire width of the continental United States. Billions upon billions of liters of water physically carried across mountain ranges, through empty desert, over hundreds of miles of nothing. Not river water, not rainwater, ocean water. Pulled straight from the sea, moved across an entire country, cleaned and used to grow forests in one of the driest, most hostile places on the entire planet. And here is the part that should make you stop and read that again. It is already working. The trees are in the ground, the pipeline is running, the desert is retreating. This is not a proposal, it is not a concept drawing. It is happening right now, and the scale of it is so enormous that even the people who built it took years to fully believe it was possible. To understand how they got here, you need to understand just how bad things got first. Because this was not a project born from ambition alone, it was born from desperation. And before we get into that, if you are the kind of person who finds this stuff genuinely fascinating, stories about engineering that quietly reshapes the world while most people are not paying attention, that is exactly what this channel is built around. Not viral headlines, not surface-level overviews, just the real mechanics of how the world actually changes. Hit subscribe and you will see why people keep coming back. A like also helps more people find this video. And honestly, this is one of those stories that deserves a bigger audience. The ground was disappearing. If you split China down the middle and look at both halves, they might as well be two different planets. The southern half is green, wet, and full of water. Rivers snake through it constantly. The Yangtze River alone carries more fresh water than most countries will ever have access to in their entire history. Rain comes reliably, reservoirs fill. Life is easy, at least when it comes to water. Now look north, completely different story. The northern half of China holds somewhere around 1/3 of the entire country's population. It is where some of the biggest cities in the world sit. It is where an enormous portion of the country's food is grown. It is where massive industrial zones hum along 24 hours a day, consuming water by the billions of liters. And that entire half of the country sits on less than 10% of China's fresh water supply, 10% of the water, 1/3 of the people. Do the math on that, and it is already alarming. Now factor in that for decades, the North survived by pumping water out of the ground. Water that had been slowly accumulating underground for thousands of years, ancient reserves built up over millennia, and you start to understand the size of the problem. Because you cannot pump ancient groundwater forever. Once it is gone, it is gone. You will not see it refill in your lifetime, or your children's lifetimes, or their children's lifetimes, and China was pumping it out fast. Faster than anyone had projected. Faster than the infrastructure was designed to handle. Then, the ground itself started sinking. Not metaphorically, literally. Cities in northern China were physically dropping in elevation year after year as the water beneath them was removed, and nothing replaced the empty space. In some areas, the subsidence was measurable in meters. Buildings developed cracks, roads buckled. Infrastructure that had been designed with one set of ground conditions suddenly found itself sitting on something completely different. And while the cities were sinking, the desert was advancing. The Gobi Desert, one of the largest and most aggressive deserts in Asia, was creeping southward and eastward at a pace that shocked researchers. Sand dunes were appearing in places that had been farmland a generation earlier. Villages that showed up clearly on maps from the 1980s were completely buried under sand by the early 2000s. Roads built to last 50 years were swallowed in 10. Dust storms originating in the desert were traveling hundreds of miles and turning the skies over major cities a deep, hazy orange in the middle of the afternoon. Farmers were watching their wells go dry. A well that used to hit water at 30 meters had to be drilled to 100 meters, then deeper, then nothing at all. Families that had worked the same land for generations were looking at the very real possibility of having to abandon everything and move. Scientists were publishing reports that nobody in government wanted to read, laying out which regions would need to be evacuated first and on what timeline. The sand was not creeping, it was charging, and the most alarming part was not just how far it had already come, it was the acceleration. Researchers mapping the desert boundaries decade by decade found that the rate of advance was speeding up, not slowing down. More land lost per year in the 90s than in the 80s. More again in the 2000s. It was as if the desert was learning how to move faster the more ground it took. The human cost of all this was immense and largely invisible to the outside world. Entire communities built by parents and grandparents, with schools and temples and markets and history stretching back generations, simply ceased to exist. People packed what they could carry and moved to already crowded cities, swapping a dying village for an overcrowded apartment. Agricultural knowledge accumulated over centuries about which crops grew best, in which soil and how to read the seasonal water patterns. All of it went unused because the land it applied to was gone. Meanwhile, the dust storms were getting worse. Northern Chinese cities were experiencing orange skies and zero visibility events that a generation earlier would have seemed apocalyptic. Fine desert particulates were being detected in air quality monitors thousands of kilometers away. The Gobi was not just a geographic fact anymore. It was a weather system. And the question was no longer whether something drastic needed to happen. The question was whether anything drastic enough actually existed. Turns out it did. It just required rethinking what was physically possible. But the solution the engineers proposed didn't just sound expensive. To anyone who understood the laws of physics and chemistry, it sounded like a recipe for a completely different kind of disaster. The first move was something that had been discussed for decades, but never fully attempted on a scale that could rewrite the map of a continent. If the North did not have enough water and the South had more than it could ever use, the obvious question was simple. Why not just connect them? It is the kind of idea a child would draw on a napkin. But moving a river across an entire country is an entirely different reality. The resulting infrastructure, known as the South to North Water Transfer Project, is the single largest water-moving network ever constructed by human hands. To understand its scale, consider that it spans over 4,300 kilometers. That is roughly equivalent to laying a continuous pipe from the Atlantic coast of the United States all the way to the Pacific. It utilizes 3 massive artificial channels slicing through the country, one hugging the eastern coast, one cutting right through the central plains, and a third carving directly through western mountain ranges. The system is designed to move nearly 45 billion cubic meters of water every single year. That is enough to fill 18 million Olympic-sized swimming pools annually, running continuously without a single pause. To achieve this, engineers had to bore thousands of tunnels through solid mountain rock and build hundreds of elevated river crossings, essentially creating a massive artificial plumbing system that acts as a second major river network. By 2022, the system had already delivered over 50 billion cubic meters of water, stabilizing the collapsing underground aquifers of Beijing and saving dying northern farmlands. Yet, even as the concrete dried on this monumental achievement, the engineers realized a painful truth. It was not going to be enough. The cities were saved from sinking, but the desert was still moving. The sand did not care about freshwater pipelines or rerouted rivers. It kept grinding southward. Rerouting existing rivers was a zero-sum game, because you can only take so much water from the south before the south begins to suffer. To truly halt the desert, they needed a completely new source of water. They needed a source that was infinite. That is when the thinking shifted toward the ocean. But using seawater for land restoration is historically one of the worst ideas you can possibly have. Seawater does not just fail to help plants grow, it actively poisons the soil. The salt draws moisture out of plant roots, crystallizes in the dirt, and turns arable land into a hard, sterile crust. The Romans famously salted the fields of Carthage specifically to ensure nothing would ever grow there again. So, how do you take billions of liters of highly corrosive, plant-killing ocean water, move it hundreds of kilometers inland, and use it to grow a forest? The core mechanism relies on a concept called industrial-scale pressure-driven desalination. But the real genius is how the physics of moving the water is used to clean the water. To understand how this works, we have to look at the massive physical challenges of the pipeline itself. Seawater is about 2.5% heavier than fresh water because of the dissolved salts. Pushing that extra weight through a pipe for hundreds of kilometers creates immense friction, which generates heat and causes accelerated corrosion. Salt eats through standard industrial steel like acid through paper. To solve this, the pipeline walls are lined with a highly specialized, multi-layered polymer coating that prevents the salt ions from ever making physical contact with the steel. It functions essentially like a high-tech Teflon frying pan, allowing the water to slide through with minimal friction while completely shielding the metal beneath. But the real breakthrough happens at the pump stations. Standard pipelines use massive brute force pumps to shove water forward. But if a pump suddenly shuts down due to a power failure, a phenomenon known as a water hammer occurs. Imagine a freight train slamming its brakes instantly. The momentum causes a catastrophic shockwave. Inside a pipe, billions of liters of fast-moving, heavy seawater slamming into a closed valve can split industrial steel wide open. To prevent this, the system uses a network of synchronized, computer-controlled variable frequency pumps. Instead of shoving the water in a single violent stream, these pumps pulse the water forward in coordinated harmonic waves. It is the fluid dynamics equivalent of pushing someone on a swing at the exact right moment to keep them moving smoothly without using sudden, jerking force. Once this heavy, highly pressurized water finally reaches the edge of the desert after a journey of hundreds of kilometers, it possesses an immense amount of kinetic energy and internal pressure. In a standard system, that pressure would have to be bled off using release valves, wasting the energy entirely. Instead, the engineers route this high-pressure seawater directly into massive reverse osmosis filtration chambers. Reverse osmosis works by forcing water through a semi-permeable membrane, with holes so incredibly small that they are measured in nanometers. These pores are wide enough to let a water molecule slip through, but too small for larger salt ions to pass. Normally, running a desalination plant requires an enormous amount of electricity just to generate the extreme pressure needed to force water through these microscopic filters. But because the pipeline has already spent hundreds of kilometers building up immense hydraulic pressure via its pump stations, that existing energy is harvested directly to power the filtration process. The water effectively desalinates itself using the momentum of its own journey. On one side of the membrane, pure, crisp freshwater pours out, ready for the desert. On the other side, a highly concentrated salt brine is left behind. Instead of dumping this environmental hazard back into the ecosystem, the brine is diverted into industrial evaporation pans, where the salt is harvested and sold for manufacturing and chemical processing. The system produces virtually zero waste. It is an incredibly elegant, self-sustaining loop of physics and chemistry. But when this mechanism was first proposed on paper, international experts were profoundly skeptical. The math worked, but the real-world variables of a desert, extreme temperature swings, shifting sands, and isolated infrastructure, made it seem impossible to execute. To prove it could actually work, the technology had to be tested not in a laboratory, and not even in China, but in one of the most volatile and unforgiving environments on the planet. To prove a system like this could function outside of a controlled laboratory, the underlying technology needed a brutal, real-world trial. That test came from an unexpected partnership on the other side of the Asian continent. In 2025, a massive $2.5 billion infrastructure contract was signed to lay a 950-kilometer pipeline network stretching straight out of the Persian Gulf and deep into the arid interior of Iraq. The strategic goal here was not to irrigate crops or provide drinking water to cities, but to solve an invisible resource crisis that was quietly bleeding the region dry. When an oil field ages, the natural underground pressure that forces the crude to the surface inevitably drops. To keep the oil flowing, engineers have to pump massive volumes of liquid deep underground to replace the empty space and push the remaining reserves upward. For decades, Iraq had been forced to use precious, drinkable freshwater for this industrial process, literally burying millions of liters of life-saving water into the dark recesses of depleted oil wells while surface communities faced severe shortages. By deploying the advanced anti-corrosion pipeline and synchronized wave pumping systems, Engineers began moving heavy, raw seawater directly from the Gulf into the heart of the desert oil fields. The system worked. The pipes held against the blistering Gulf heat. The automated sensors successfully neutralized the threat of pressure shocks, and Iraq immediately began saving billions of cubic meters of fresh water every single year. It was the definitive proof of concept. The technology was no longer a theoretical line on a chalkboard. It was a functioning, scalable reality operating in one of the most hostile climates on Earth. With the mechanics validated, attention returned to the ultimate geographic boss battle, the Taklamakan Desert in northwestern China. The name itself translates from local Turkic languages to a grim warning: you go in, you do not come out, covering an area larger than Germany and France combined. It is a shifting wilderness of loose sand dunes that can tower over 300 meters high, tall enough to swallow a 60-story skyscraper. For centuries, this massive sandbox had been expanding outward, relentlessly eating up roads, burying generational farmlands, and generating apocalyptic dust storms that choked cities thousands of kilometers away. Instead of fighting a defensive retreat, the strategy shifted to a total encirclement. The goal was to build an unbroken green belt of living vegetation, stretching over 3,000 kilometers completely around the perimeter of the desert. In late 2024, after decades of incremental effort culminating in the deployment of these new long-distance water systems, that perimeter loop was officially closed. But you cannot just plant trees in the sand and walk away. The ecosystem requires a meticulous, hyper-efficient delivery mechanism. The freshwater generated by the pipeline's pressure-driven filtration is fed into an intricate web of precision drip irrigation tubing laid directly onto the desert floor. Computerized nodes deliver micro-doses of water directly to the root zones of specific battle-hardened plant species. The primary weapon in this botanical army is the Saxaul tree, a gnarled shrub-like plant built for absolute punishment. The Saxaul does not waste energy growing a pretty canopy. Instead, its root system explodes outward horizontally beneath the surface, weaving through the loose sand like a biological cargo net. Once these roots lock together, they achieve something remarkable. They freeze the shifting dunes in place. As the ground stabilizes, a powerful ecological domino effect begins. The presence of the trees breaks up the fierce ground-level winds, causing the air's speed to drop dramatically. With less wind whipping away moisture, local humidity ticks upward, creating a tiny, fragile microclimate. The brutal temperature swings between the blistering day and freezing desert night begin to soften. Slowly, organic matter builds up, and the sand begins the agonizingly slow transformation into actual, living soil. Small shrubs, grasses, and eventually native wildlife start to return to zones that were entirely sterile just a decade prior. This localized victory is actually the spearhead of a much grander historical trend. Since 1978, the country has been quietly executing the 3 North Shelter Belt program, an engineering campaign of unprecedented scale colloquially known as the Green Great Wall. Over 66 billion trees have been planted across the arid northern territories over the last half-century, driving the nation's total forest cover from a meager 10% in 1949 to over 25% today. The closed loop around the Taklamakan is the high-tech crown jewel of this multi-generational effort. The strategic implications of this toolkit stretch far beyond East Asia. For all of recorded history, geography was an absolute, unyielding destiny. Civilizations rose and fell strictly based on where nature decided to place freshwater. The Nile built Egypt. The Tigris and Euphrates dictated the terms of Mesopotamia. If the river dried up or the climate shifted, the civilization died. There was no alternative. By decoupling water security from local geography, these technologies are effectively rewriting the foundational rules of human settlement. Think about the global implications. The Sahara Desert covers over 9 million square kilometers of North Africa. If even a fractional percentage of that barren expanse could be stabilized and greened using coastal seawater pipelines, it would trigger an agricultural and economic transformation unseen in the modern era. The wealthy but severely water-stressed nations of the Arabian Peninsula, or the communities surrounding the collapsing Aral Sea Basin in Central Asia, are staring down existential resource crises within the next few decades. The ability to manufacture and transport freshwater over vast distances means the maps we have lived by for 5,000 years are suddenly highly fluid. Deserts are no longer permanent, unalterable scars on the planet. They are simply incredibly expensive engineering puzzles waiting to be solved. But as any veteran analyst knows, when you manipulate nature on a continental scale, the universe always exacts a price. Moving billions of liters of water and anchoring entire ecosystems changes more than just the color of the ground on a satellite map. It triggers shifts in atmospheric pressure, alters regional water tables, and disrupts geopolitical balances in ways that are incredibly difficult to predict. And as these massive pipelines begin to push deeper into the dead zones of the world, engineers are discovering that stopping the desert was actually the easy part. The real danger is what happens to the weather when you succeed. When you alter the surface of the Earth on a scale this massive, you are doing more than just planting trees. You are changing how the planet breathes. Climatologists studying the regions around the green spaces have already begun documenting a subtle but unmistakable shift in regional weather patterns. By introducing billions of leaves where there was once only baking sand, engineers have effectively created giant biological evaporative coolers. The moisture releasing from these new forests alters local atmospheric pressure, which in turn can pull in rain clouds that previously would have sailed right over the desert without dropping a single drop. But this is exactly where the story stops making sense to traditional ecologists. For decades, conventional wisdom warned that planting massive forests in naturally arid zones would act like an environmental sponge, sucking up what little groundwater remained and leaving the deeper aquifers completely hollowed out. In the early days of the 3 North Shelter Belt project, that is exactly what happened. Monoculture forests, miles upon miles of identical, thirsty poplar trees, withered and died, draining local water tables and leaving behind timber graveyards. The turning point came when engineers stopped trying to force a standard forest into the sand and instead leaned into the hyper-precise, data-driven architecture of modern fluid dynamics. By shifting away from native groundwater and relying entirely on the high-tech loop of pipeline-driven, desalinated coastal water, they avoided the collapse of local water tables. They realized that you cannot outsmart a desert by brute force. You have to treat it like a highly calibrated mechanical system where every liter of water must be tracked by digital sensors and delivered via subsurface drip lines directly to specialized root systems. This technological paradigm shift is precisely why these projects are transforming from a domestic defense mechanism into an aggressive global infrastructure export. Through its international investment networks, engineering firms are now packaging these exact toolkits: the polymer-coated anti-corrosion pipes, the synchronized harmonic wave pumps, the pressure-harvesting filtration membranes, and the specialized plant science, and offering them to nations across the Middle East, Central Asia, and North Africa. We are talking about regions that international resource groups have flagged as imminent water collapse zones. These are places where summer temperatures routinely breach the threshold of human endurance, and where farming communities are watching their ancient wells dry up to absolute zero. For these nations, the acquisition of a cross-country seawater pipeline network is not an expensive luxury or an environmental vanity project. It is a matter of basic existential survival over the next 50 years. But as these infrastructure networks expand across international borders, they bring a completely new set of geopolitical variables. Water has always been the ultimate flashpoint for conflict. Historically, nations have threatened war over who controls the headwaters of a major river. When you replace a natural river with a 1,000-kilometer artificial pipeline built, monitored, and maintained by a foreign superpower, the balance of power shifts completely. The country that controls the software updates for the synchronized pump stations and holds the patents on the anti-corrosive linings effectively holds the literal lifeline of the nation receiving the water. The map is being rewritten, but the lines of control are becoming digital and hidden inside steel valves buried under the sand. This brings us right back to that absolute, unyielding rule we started with, the rule that said for 5,000 years, geography is destiny. The rule that dictated humans must humble themselves before the placement of rivers and the patterns of rain, or face total obliteration. That ancient contract has officially been torn up. What we are witnessing in the empty spaces of northwestern China and the deserts of Iraq is the first real evidence that humanity has figured out how to build its own rivers from scratch, using the infinite reserve of the world's oceans to push back against the boundaries of nature. The desert is no longer the undefeated champ of geography. It is a landscape subject to engineering intervention, provided you have the capital, the technology, and the raw political will to bend physics to your side. It is a transformation so profound that most of the world has not even begun to internalize what it means for the future of human civilization. We are entering an era where we live, where we grow our food, and how we define habitable land will no longer be determined by where nature put the water, but by where we choose to build the pipe. The old world was defined by finding resources. The next century will be defined by manufacturing them across hundreds of miles of absolute nothingness. If this deep dive into the hidden mechanics of how the world is being reshaped blew your mind, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and make sure your notifications are turned on so you don't miss our next investigation. We go past the surface headlines every single week to find the real stories of engineering that most people completely miss. And before you go, here is the question for the comments section. If you could deploy this exact technology to completely green any desert on Earth, which one would you pick? And what do you think the unexpected side effects would be? Let us know below, and we will see you in the next video.